It's the Fourth Age. Sauron is gone. The ring is destroyed. Aragorn sits on the throne of Gondor. The great evils of Middle-earth have passed. But what happened to the orcs? Did they fade into the shadows? Or did they get day jobs? Is your co-worker named Ted actually a goblin man with a decent dental plan? Is your daughter dating a half-orc named Steve, who's into microbrews and CrossFit? Tolkien never gave us a clear answer. Some orcs fled, some were destroyed, some might have survived. Today we dive into one of the strangest mysteries in Tolkien's legendarium and explore what might have become of Middle-earth's most infamous foot soldiers after the fall of Sauron. Let's start with what we actually know from Tolkien's writings, because when it comes to the fate of orcs, the professor was frustratingly sparse on details. In the appendices to The Return of the King, Tolkien tells us that after Sauron's defeat, the orcs were scattered like leaves before a wind. Most fled in terror when their master's will was broken, abandoning the Black Gate and Mordor entirely. But scattered doesn't mean extinct. In an unpublished epilogue to The Lord of the Rings, one that Tolkien ultimately decided against including, Sam Gamgee mentions that orcs might still be lurking in the depths of Moria. This suggests that even years after the War of the Ring, pockets of orcs remained hidden in the deep places of the world. The key insight comes from Tolkien's notes in The Peoples of Middle-earth and Morgoth's Ring. Here, he explains that orcs were fundamentally dependent on domination. Without a unifying will, whether Morgoth's or Sauron's, they inevitably devolved into squabbling, leaderless bands. But here's where it gets interesting. Tolkien also wrote extensively about Saruman's breeding experiments. The White Wizard didn't just create traditional orcs, he engineered something new, half-orcs and goblin men, creatures that could pass for men in dim light or at a distance. In The Two Towers, we're told these hybrid creatures were slant-eyed and sallow-faced, but crucially, they could blend into human populations. After Isengard fell and Saruman was defeated, what happened to these creatures? Unlike the orcs of Mordor, who were bound to Sauron's will, Saruman's creations possessed a degree of independence. They could think, plan, and most importantly, survive without a master. Tolkien hints that many of these half-orcs fled into the wildlands around Bree and Dunland during the chaos of war. Unlike their full-blooded cousins, they had the intelligence and appearance necessary to potentially integrate into human society, or at least survive on its fringes. To understand what happened to the orcs after Sauron's fall, we need to understand what orcs fundamentally are in Tolkien's conception. They're not just another fantasy race, they're a corruption, a perversion of the natural order. A machine without an engine. That's what the orcs became without a Dark Lord. In Morgoth's Ring, Tolkien explores the nature of evil in his world, and orcs feature prominently in this discussion. He describes them as creatures that multiply rapidly when left to their own devices, but lack the organizational capability to build lasting civilizations. They're inherently destructive, turning on each other without an external force to direct their malice. So what are the possibilities for post-Sauron orc survival? Theory 1. Petty orc realms. Some scholars of Middle-earth lore suggest that the strongest orc chieftains might have carved out small territories in the wild lands. Picture tiny, brutal kingdoms hidden in the Misty Mountains or the Grey Mountains, constantly warring with each other and slowly dwindling through endless conflict. These wouldn't be the massive armies of Mordor, but desperate bands of survivors clinging to caves and ruins. Theory 2. The Deep Retreat. Others propose that orcs, being creatures of shadow and underground places, might have retreated so far from the light that they effectively removed themselves from the world above. Deep in abandoned mines, forgotten tunnels, and cavern systems, they could have persisted for generations, a hidden remnant slowly fading away in the darkness. Theory 3. The Hunt. But there's a darker possibility. With Sauron gone and Aragorn establishing his reign, There would have been systematic efforts to cleanse Middle-earth of remaining threats. The Dunedain, the Rohirrim, even ordinary farmers and townspeople would have every incentive to hunt down surviving orcs. These creatures had ravaged the lands for centuries. Mercy would be in short supply. Tolkien himself seemed to lean toward this interpretation. In his letters, he suggested that most orcs would have been hunted down and destroyed in the years following the War of the Ring. Without their unifying force, without their infrastructure, without their breeding pits and armories, the scattered orc bands would have been vulnerable to any organized human force. Tolkien hints that many of these half-orcs fled into the wildlands around Bree and Dunland during the chaos of war. Unlike their full-blooded cousins, they had the intelligence and appearance necessary to potentially integrate into human society, or at least survive on its fringes. But while the full-blooded orcs likely met grim fates, Saruman's hybrid creations present a very different story. These half-orcs and goblin men were Tolkien's most unsettling creation, not because of their physical prowess, but because of their potential for survival. Think about it logically. When Isengard fell and the scouring of the Shire began, where would these creatures go? They couldn't return to Mordor. Sauron's forces would have rejected them as impure. They couldn't establish their own settlements. They lacked the numbers and resources. But they could do something no traditional orc could do: disappear into human society. The lands around Bree were already known for their rough characters and questionable inhabitants. Dunland had long harbored men who bore grudges against Rohan and Gondor. These were perfect places for creatures who could pass as sallow-faced or ill-favored men to blend in and survive. Consider the implications. A half-orc with sufficient cunning could become a merchant, a laborer, even a craftsman. They might marry human partners, and if Tolkien's notes about orc reproduction are accurate, their children would carry an even more diluted strain of orc heritage. Within a few generations, the obvious physical markers might fade entirely. Could some bloodlines of the Fourth Age still carry the marks of the White Hand? This isn't just speculation, it's the logical extension of Tolkien's own world-building. He created these hybrid creatures specifically because they could survive in ways that traditional orcs could not. The question isn't whether some survived, but how many and how far their influence spread. And here's the unsettling part. Unlike orcs, who were obviously monstrous, these hybrids could carry forward the worst aspects of orcish nature: the cruelty, the cunning, the capacity for corruption, hidden within seemingly human bloodlines. They could be the merchants who cheat their customers, the officials who abuse their power, the neighbors who turn vicious when they think no one is watching. But perhaps we're thinking about this question too literally. Tolkien was never just telling a fantasy story. He was crafting a mythology that spoke to deeper truths about human nature and the modern world. In Tolkien's conception, orc isn't just a species, it's a state of being. It represents the capacity for cruelty, for dehumanization, for the reduction of thinking beings into mere instruments of domination. In his letters, Tolkien explicitly connected orcs to his observations of industrialized warfare and mechanized society. He is said to have muttered "orc" at rude drivers. Maybe we still do. Think about what Tolkien witnessed in his lifetime: the mechanized slaughter of World War I, the rise of totalitarian regimes, the dehumanization of modern industrial society. The orcs weren't just fantasy monsters. They were his way of exploring how ordinary people could be corrupted into instruments of evil. From this perspective, the question, what happened to the orcs, becomes much more complex. Did they die out, or did they simply evolve? In our world, we don't have literal orcs, but we have systems that create orc-like behavior. We have ideologies that strip away empathy and compassion. We have structures that reward cruelty and domination. Every person who follows orders without questioning their morality, every individual who inflicts suffering for personal gain, every system that treats human beings as disposable resources, In Tolkien's symbolic framework, these carry forward the essence of what orcs represented. Maybe the orcs didn't disappear after Sauron's fall. Maybe they just learned to hide their true nature better. Maybe they traded their crude armor for business suits, their crude weapons for bureaucratic power, their crude fortresses for corporate headquarters. This reading suggests that the battle against the orcs never truly ended. It just moved from the physical realm to the moral and spiritual realm. Every generation faces the choice between compassion and cruelty, between building up and tearing down, between serving life or serving domination. But there's one more layer to consider, and it might be the most fascinating of all. Tolkien always insisted that Middle-earth wasn't a fantasy world, it was our world, in a forgotten age. The events of The Lord of the Rings were meant to be prehistory, a mythic past that led to the world we know today. If we take this seriously, then the orcs didn't just disappear from literature, they faded from history into legend, into the dark corners of human memory and folklore. Think about it. Every culture on Earth has stories of malevolent creatures that lurk in the shadows. Goblins, trolls, bogeymen, demons, beings that steal children, corrupt the innocent and spread chaos. Could these be the cultural echoes of actual encounters with orcs in humanity's distant past? The creatures that haunt our Halloween celebrations, the monsters that parents warn their children about, the things that go bump in the night. Maybe these aren't just products of imagination. Maybe they're genetic memories, cultural DNA passed down from ancestors who actually faced orcs in battle. Consider how perfectly orc characteristics match the archetypal evil creature found in cultures worldwide. The yellowed teeth, the cruel laughter, the delight in causing pain, the tendency to work in groups, the fear of sunlight, the connection to underground places. These traits appear again and again in human folklore, across cultures that had no contact with each other. In this interpretation, the orcs accomplished something remarkable. They survived the transition from history to myth. While the elves faded into stories of fairies and nature spirits, while the dwarves became legends of mountain folk and craftsmen, the orcs became our nightmares. They became the universal symbol of malevolent otherness that parents use to teach children about danger. Or perhaps, just perhaps, some small number of actual orcs survived long enough to interbreed with humans, contributing to the gene pool that eventually became us. Those moments of irrational cruelty, those flashes of sadistic pleasure, those times when we surprise ourselves with our capacity for malice, could these be the orc heritage still echoing in human DNA? Whether extinguished or diluted, the age of orcs ended, but the memory and the warning remains. So what happened to the orcs after Sauron's fall? The truth is, Tolkien left us with a mystery, and perhaps that was intentional. The literal answer is probably the simplest. Most orcs died. They were hunted down, they killed each other, or they simply couldn't survive without the dark infrastructure that had sustained them for millennia. The age of orcs ended with the Third Age, but some of Saruman's hybrids likely survived, blending into human populations and passing on diluted traces of their heritage through the generations. If you want to imagine that your least favorite co-worker has a distant orc ancestor, well, Tolkien's world building doesn't rule it out. More importantly, the orcs live on as symbols and warnings. They represent the eternal human capacity for corruption, for choosing domination over cooperation, for surrendering moral agency to authority figures who promise easy answers to complex problems. In the end, perhaps the most honest answer is this. The orcs went wherever all our monsters go when we stop believing in them literally, but can't stop feeling their presence symbolically. They retreated into the shadows of our collective unconscious, waiting to remind us what we might become if we're not careful. The age of orcs may be over, but the choice between orc and not orc, between cruelty and kindness, between domination and cooperation, that choice remains with us every single day. What do you think happened to the orcs? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into Middle-earth's greatest mysteries. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this type of content, don't forget to like and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next one.